Yo, what's cracking, folks? Welcome to episode number 31 of The Painter and the Pixie. I'm your host, Gerry Vassar, and as always, I'm joined by our other lovely host, Serena.
Hi, everybody.
And this is part 2 of hopefully a 7-part series. We're calling this When Shit Hits the Fan, A Guide to Personal Crisis.
Yeah.
Last week, which was part 1, we talked about observer roles with my dad and kind of just gave an overview of personal crisis and how to respond effectively, whether it's your own crisis or someone else you were helping through one. So in this episode, my dad is back on, and we're talking about another one of his Jimmy Jams, which is Family Legacies.
This is kind of the first part of our skill set series. You know, the first episode was like, hey, here's what it looks like to get through a personal crisis. And
but I would say the observer role.
Yeah,
is definitely
that's true.
a skill.
That is definitely, You're right. That is a skill. But this is another skill. It's like,
Yes.
how do you understand family legacies and how do you use that understanding to help you get through the personal crisis?
Yeah.
Understanding your own personal legacies and other people's.
Yeah. So, and this has been a request. My dad touched on this when we went over relational integrity in an earlier episode. If you haven't listened to that, I would highly recommend going back and, refreshing on that one. But we're going in a much deeper dive into family legacies and kind of defining what those are, what those look like, positive and negative.
Yeah,
'Cause,
definitely. There's
some of the
both.
some of the stuff we're talking about tends to be negative because we're focusing on the crisis portion,
Right.
but there are positive elements as well.
This was one of my favorite episodes to
yeah.
record. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be, I think you guys will really like it.
It was good. So, all right, guys, without further ado, please enjoy episode number 31 of The Painter and the Pixie.
This is only the beginning.
All right, ready?
Ready?
What you're going to hear about today is nothing short of a miracle.
Well, I don't believe it.
Let's find out. Ready, set, go.
Ooh, boy. All right. We are back again with Pops is joining us for round 2 of, I guess, the second part in our series on, how to deal with personal crisis when shit hits the fan. And one of the things we were kind of talking about last week was why, when folks are doing things and they're not quite sure why they're doing what they're doing. So kind of like that song. What is it? The song, the old Is it Temptations? The way you do the things
the way
you do.
you do the things.
Yeah. So, and this is a subject that has been requested amongst the interwebs. So, it's the subject you've all been waiting for: family legacies. So, and much like a lot of what we have talked about so far, a lot of this stuff has been introduced to me by either you or Diane. So, do you? What's your jumping off point of where you want to start the navigating these waters?
Well, I do want to credit Diane for helping me understand more about what this was. I think we observe it all the time, but one of the things that happens when we're having discussions with folks about why they do things that seemingly to them seem very normal, but to the rest of us, we look at it and go, what is that and why and what and where? You're kidding, right? But in the process, and it causes significant conflict and significant problems with our children or with our spouses or with people we work with. And what I find illuminating is that when we go back and say, well, tell me, how did your parents discipline you, or how did that relationship, or what messages were there in your families? And often there is this interesting connection to the messages we receive as children and the behaviors that we do in life. And then when you find a level of consistency, and when you find that there are moments where people as children have experiences when they can vividly remember the color of the wallpaper, the images around them, the sounds, the smells, the things that happen. There was a moment where some message or some major issue imprinted in their being. It shapes your core beliefs. It shapes your brain neural pathways and how you're wired. It shapes all kinds of ways of thinking. And all of a sudden, you find yourself doing the things that you might repudiate or the things that you have been taught to do because it's sort of hardwired in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're doing things and you don't understand why. And of course, some people don't even know that they're doing things
Right.
until someone points it out. And they say, look, I can't stand that you do this every day. And you go, what?
Yeah, do what?
Do
what
what?
are you talking about?
This is my norm because I was raised with it. I'm
Mhm.
loyal to. And the interesting issue that I think is a natural occurrence for most people is that we become loyal to it.
Mm-hmm.
To be disloyal to that value is in fact to be disloyal to my parents.
Mm.
And sometimes in my understanding of the value that I might repudiate, I'll never do that to my kids,
Yeah.
will almost compensate too far, but for the very same reason,
Mhm.
because it was done to you.
You're almost loyal to it in like the other direction.
In the
like
other
it's such a
direction.
complete overcompensation. Yeah.
So now we're trying too hard on the other side. So family legacies are really a set of messages and core beliefs that we are taught. And some of them, by the way, are wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
They're
Yeah.
great things.
Yeah, it's not all negative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They're great things and wonderful opportunities for parents to give great values to their children. But those aren't the things that defeat relationships and
Right.
put us into crisis either.
Yeah, no one's like talking to you because they have an amazing history with family dinners.
And,
Like, that's,
and if you think about it in a very interesting way, being loyal is a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
unless you're loyal to something that's really destructive.
Right.
So in the process of this, it's an amazing dynamic when you think about certain messages that are like the most popular one is the not good enough principle.
Mm-hmm.
I know people whose parents have died and they're still trying to live up to their expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Because somehow along the way, parents believe that if I keep telling you, you're never going to make it. If you keep doing that, you'll never be, or you can't be, and you've got to keep on going. And somehow some folks have been taught in past generations that if you do enough of that negative talk, people will rise up and rebel and they'll be great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, suppose they submit to it.
Right.
Then they fall apart. I remember coaching Little League. Coaches would be screaming at kids.
Yeah.
If you don't put your glove on the ground ball, you will never ever play baseball. And you'll be worthless. Yeah. They would accuse them of being unworthy
Terrible.
and stupid and this and that. And I would say things like, "Well, if you need to put your glove on the ground so you'll catch the ball."
yeah,
That's a big difference.
That's a very big difference.
You can functionally be pretty good if you just do this habit.
watch it go into your glove.
But you know what? If you teach fear, if everything you do to teach is fear, then basically I'm in the low start of my brain and I'm not in a place to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So then I just become acclimated to it, submit to it, keep on doing it, and don't even know that I am
Right.
until someone points it out and says, where was that in you? How did you? What
Yeah.
goes on in your past? When did that learn? How come you? And in the process, you really learn, wow. And I love, I'm sick and wrong here, but I love the moment where they go, oh my gosh, I remember. I get it. I've had so many people in my
Yeah.
office go, they almost go into shock and awe. Oh my God. I mean, it's almost, that's alarming to me.
Yeah.
I just learned, oh no. And then like 50 things unfolded
Mm-hmm.
because they remember now the moment. I had one individual who got fired from their job. And I won't say the reason, but they got fired. And it was definitely them trying to regulate and be good enough for the job.
Mm.
And they just started doing really crooked things. And this person was competent and everyone liked them and they were this interesting person that, all the girls loved him and he was, and I got him one day to tell the story, and he said it had to do with, some of the vices had to do with women, and I said, tell me about your experience with your mom. And he said, oh. I said, does anything really stand out to you in your relationship with her? He goes, oh yeah. I said, what's that? He goes, she used to ask me to clean the house. And I'd clean the house. And man, I made sure it was spotless. I would work my tail off to make that thing right. You know what she did? She came home and found the one spot that was left that I missed. And she'd say, I can't believe you missed that. This person can never be good enough. Their marriage folded. Their relationships folded. Their job folded. And when we had discussions about it, it pointed to that crazy little issue.
Wow.
That he's still trying to undo decades later.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how loyal we become to parenting styles, to certain issues. And if we had we know from the ACEs study, Adverse Child Events study, that if we had parents who were, alcoholics or abusive or one left or whatever, that also has an imprint on our brain development. So we're incapable at some points of doing certain things straight because we were taught to do them crooked.
Yeah.
And we become, the power of the loyalty of that is impressive.
Now, some of that's loyalty, as in your beliefs, but you mentioned this earlier, some of that's the wiring of your brain. And that's part of why you're so loyal to it, because of how it's been wired. It's not just like a passive choice, I'm going to stay loyal to this. That's what makes it so challenging.
Well, I think you're right. The blending of the neuroscience of your brain that says, I'm wired a certain way. If you have been in a commanding relationship, you don't get choice. Mm-hmm. So we'll say the neuroreceptors for choice don't quite connect correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of miss. Because now you want the world to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
You don't want to make the choice for yourself. One of the things I say to parents all the time is make sure at certain ages your children have choices. Mm-hmm. Because that connects their consequence center to their decision-making center. Mm-hmm. And that's a healthy thing. When I learn either negative or positive, I did this and boy, that was a mess up. That's a great thing. And a lot of people are trying to protect their kids from that. So they freak out whenever they do anything, make a bad decision. Bad decisions help neurology. Mm-hmm. It helps the wiring to happen. So the heavy control against those kinds of things. And again, I certainly believe that there ought to be boundaries. You can't run in the street. Don't jump off a train. And I mean, but don't take high risk behavior and don't try drugs just for the sake of trying drugs. But I think in the normal range of decision making, that affects your wiring. Yeah. And if that doesn't get wired properly, then you're really looking around in life for someone to command you.
Someone who can make your decisions for you.
And who are the types of people that you hook up with? Yeah. Control freaks. Who will tell you, and then what does that do long range? It leaves you in a deficit position because you have no choices. And as you become an adult, you're wondering, how come I married somebody who's a control freak? Mm-hmm. Well, because you weren't given permission to take control of your own space, and that's okay with you, or is it? Mm-hmm. It's just not healthy. But I do it because I'm loyal to the idea.
Well, it's as you grow up in a family, you normalize the relationships that you have as you grow up. So then, if you grew up with healthy relationships, then chances are you're going to seek out healthy relationships later on, because if you start experiencing unhealthy relationship, you're like, well, this is crap, and this is not my norm, and I don't enjoy this, so I want to have what I had before. But on the same token, if you had an abusive family, or even something maybe less extreme, like you just had your family enjoyed having heated arguments and screaming at each other, that's just how they process through conflict, which also can be abusive. But we're just like a healthy Italian family. They're known for being passionate about discussing things.
Passion, yes. Yeah. Passion.
Then you get, I've been at some of those dinners, and we that's not our jam. Like, we didn't have a lot of yelling in the house. It was very calm. And then, going over some of my friends' homes that have some bigger Italian family, and they just go hard in the paint. You're just like, damn. And then it's, they're going, and then they had no one was mad afterwards, but they were like screaming at each other.
It was a norm.
You're just like,
Yeah.
whoa, dude. And then, but you're likely to, that's how you're going to communicate later on because you've normalized that as a child. And that's something you're expecting going into perhaps one of your own romantic relationships in the future. It's like, we have a conflict. We're going to yell at each other and then we'll be fine.
Unless the other partner had a family that didn't yell at each other.
Then you
and
got a
now you got conflict
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's perceived as completely different.
So even something like that's, it could be, a smaller thing, but then, as you extrapolate out over time that can cause an issue down the line in a relationship. But you're kind of,
Right.
I find it fascinating that it's the loyalty to the family legacies, but a lot of people are completely unaware of where their loyalties lie, or that's even a thing, that they're replicating the relationships that they, basically, while their brain was forming, they got used to those relationships, and that's what they're replicating as they get older.
Right. Right. And the interesting thing is once it gets pointed out, clarity immediately happens.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And there's a rollout of
Shut up.
There's a rollout of so much because
Yeah.
so that the nuancing that comes out of that. So wait a minute. So if I do that, then a byproduct of that is this.
Mm-hmm.
And then this happens, and and the interesting the domino effect of this is pretty powerful over life span. And so to me, the earlier you recognize, I actually, when I was doing more premarital counseling, I actually put in 2 individual sessions to say, hey, I'd like to learn about your family so that when you come together with this person and their family is completely different than yours, what you're loyal to and what they're loyal to is 2 different things. And maybe we ought to just take a look at that before you start handling conflict.
So you would counsel the groom first or whatever, but you would do them separately. So
Separately.
the guy first and the lady
Towards
whatever,
that,
yeah.
when I'm not doing much premarital counseling anymore, but when I was doing that, I really got to the point of saying each person gets 2 individual sessions. And then when I started doing conflict resolution together, I would have a frame of reference for where their families would come from. Because if you don't know that, you get all kinds of interesting stuff. And, I know I carried some of my family's habits into my marriage, and your mom, Jeremy, carried some of hers and it was like, whoa, this is like, and of course some of mine, I said, I'll never do that. And then sure enough, I was doing that, and there it was.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, knowing your own family legacies when you're inside of it, because you can, like, I know both sets of my grandparents, so I see like how it all kind of comes together into me.
Yeah, it's helpful.
It's
Very
it's
like,
helpful.
Yeah.
like, oh wow, like, well, that came from Hugh and that came from Carl, like, it's just like
Right. Right.
but it even just being aware of them, and then if you're familiar at all with your extended family, it can shed some light on why people are doing what they're doing, because oftentimes we're presented with our family doing interesting things, and then you're like, okay, this makes a lot more sense now once you can kind of contextualize the
Yeah, it has a basis.
Yeah.
Because if you misread it or misjudge it, it can lead you to all kinds of bad places. You can make assumptions about their character. And I really rarely have I found people that are being malicious to someone else that's a legacy issue that they really love doing it.
You're right.
It wasn't something they wanted to do, and they knew it was conflictual, but the struggle is I didn't know where it was coming from and why, if I don't get to do this, I'm frustrated.
right.
I get angry because I'm working hard to do what I think is absolutely right when in fact it's completely dysfunctional. And the other person's going, but and I've watched people 20, 30 years. One person said to me, finally, somebody can tell. Oh, finally. They're so happy because it's like, we've been doing this for years and we have no idea why.
Yeah.
and I just thought I was a bad actor, or she was just angry, or he was whatever. And I think in the process, when you understand it, it gets to be, the position is more one of empathy.
Yeah.
So if your family was doing this, if you had, I'll go extreme for a minute, if you had a bipolar parent and you're acting passive aggressive all the time, if I know you learned that, I'm a lot more understanding of the fact that it is.
Yeah.
And number two, you can be a lot more aware that that's a tendency.
Right.
And figure out from whence it comes. And begin to go, hey, now I'm clear about why this is. It's not you're a jerk and you're hurting me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you put them into a position of power where you can say, now you have your choices, right? We talked about
Exactly.
having your choices back.
Exactly. So you do get your personal power back when you understand that you have choices to figure out, yeah, that's where that came from, and now I have other choices. And sometimes we have to fill in the blanks to say, here's some options that you have never once done in your life that you now have as you problem solve or have a conversation about. So
Right. And do you? So, man, I have some questions.
that's what he's good at.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Well, it seems like I'm curious how hard it is to counsel people out of family legacies. It seems to be a rather large sticking point because of how enmeshed and ingrained they can be, and almost on the unconscious level. Like you said, you're doing something and you don't even realize you're doing it. One of the things that I would have in my mind that is just comparable, I used a martial arts example last podcast. I'll use another one right now. But like guys that came into the Muay Thai gym particularly that came from another martial arts background that was a striking martial art, like Taekwondo or karate or something like that, they would throw their kicks very differently. But they trained, some kids have been doing karate since they were like 3. And the Thais kick way differently. They kick with a hip turn, and it's like it's a shin kick. They're not kicking with the instep. And it was my instructor, who was very old school, was like, I would much rather start with someone that doesn't know anything than someone who's been trained in a different way of doing things that then I have to train out, because as soon as the kid would get flustered or the student would get flustered, they're going to go back and do the technique that they knew first. And
Because that was wired in their brain.
And that was wired early
First.
and first. And it's super hard to train it out. And like that is true from grappling to striking to boxing to Muay Thai, like whatever. It's like
Basically anything.
If you learn to throw a punch this one way and it's not the best way to throw it, I'm going to try and teach you to do it. As soon as you actually get stressed, you're going to go back to doing exactly how you used to do it. And that's like everybody does that. So that's kind of my, I had no idea how to kick. So it took me a long time to understand how the mechanics of it work. But once I got it, I didn't have any reference point of like how to throw a switch kick before. So once I got it, it was technically correct. And I didn't have any, like if I got rattled, I would still throw it the exact same way because I didn't throw any kicks.
Yeah, that was
before
how you first wired it.
So, and even kids that played soccer, it's a different hip movement. So you'd think like, oh, if I played soccer, I'd be better at this. It's like, no, it's, anyway, but that's kind of what I see as like a negative, like technique legacy that's hard to break. I would imagine that these, family legacies that are less optimal are super hard to break as well, particularly when people are getting stressed, which is, I think these, perhaps you may find, Dad, that in a stressful personal crisis situation, some of these family legacy issues may present themselves when in a less stressed environment, they're a little more subdued. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think stress always accentuates whatever we're feeling emotionally. I think it's a good point, though, to say that this can be really difficult.
Yeah.
I have actually had people that I have presented, here is what I'm hearing and seeing. I've even had people say, wow, you are so smart to take me through this. And I'm now understanding that I am abusive because my father was abusive, and I did this because my father did this, and I was a victim to it, and I lived it. And then they would say, and so I'd say, okay, so now that we've been through that and you think I'm wonderful, let's start the change.
Yeah, what are we going to do about that?
And the change means you're going to be disloyal. And I've watched them walk away.
They're like,
Yeah.
no.
Nope. Too strong.
I'm
Yeah.
not doing it. Because that means I would have to be vulnerable, that I would have to be admitting what my father or whoever wouldn't admit. That I would have to say I'm going to be disloyal to that powerhouse, of in my life. And I really can't afford to do that. But really they're living in the same fear and insecurity that was created, and they want to create that as their domain so that they can have control because they're afraid to be in the vulnerable position of being authentic. So the power of these things is pretty significant to some people. So the work of, you've got to have a bit of a motivational crisis. And then you've got to be willing to see what it is. And for the sake of whatever altruistic thing that needs to happen, I need to work on this or fix that, or work with, I have a guy that's working with trying to fix what happened between him and his children right now. And he's in his 80s. You've got to say, I want that fixed. I want this to be done. I'm motivated. I want to learn how to do the kick.
Right.
Because I want to be technically proficient. Well, I want to be emotionally proficient. And I want to leave a legacy that's different than what happened. I repudiate what happened to me. So now I've realized I have instilled it in my children or in people around me, and I'm trying to fix that. I have all kinds of interesting people that disconnected from their families because of this stuff, and then they lived a disconnected life. And now they're going, oh my goodness, I haven't connected to anybody. Well, of course you haven't, because you were taught that's not safe.
Yeah.
So you might have been the leader of a corporation and connected to nobody there, and didn't have any relationships because you were so in a space of saying, I just can't do that, because if I do, I will be defiling all of the, being disloyal to all the issues that I have been taught to be. And the liability of that is too much for me to change. So this is work.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work to say, I am aware. I am understanding the depth of it. I am willing to practice my way out of it. And I'm willing to keep reflecting on it to realize that I'm still unaware about other pieces of it, and go through that cycle that we call steps of growth so many times until I really get it. And then the role of anybody that's working with you, and be it your spouse or whoever, is to keep coaching and saying, yeah, that's great. Affirm, and oops. How about that part of it? What do you think? And work that way.
Yeah.
Can you recap the steps of growth for us?
Steps of growth start that you are realizing that you are completely in the basement, meaning you know nothing.
You're
not
nothing, Johnson.
aware. Your unawareness level is huge.
Yeah.
And then you have an aha moment. And you go, oh, I am now aware that I'm unaware. So that happens quite often when you point at a family legacy.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. That means, I have that happen quite frequently.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Then usually there's a period of understanding. What does it mean that that's a family legacy? What does it mean to your daily life? What does it mean to what you've learned? What does it mean to your process? What it means to your growing up? What is it? There's a lot of information that we are learning through when we are aware that this thing has happened, because now where did it come from, and why do you think it was there? I mean, one of the big issues when it's really negative is, how do people not be angry at their parents? They did that to me. Well, guess what? Somebody did that to them. It's not their fault either.
Yeah.
But it's still, what do I do with that lack of trust? So all of that resides in the understanding phase of all the details of it, the nuances of it, of what it's created in you and in those around you, because now you've impacted others with this stuff. So there's that understanding level. And of course, when you go to understanding level, you go through all the realizations and other things of grief and loss and whatever. But then you can say, wait a minute, I'm going to practice something different. And that's your next stairway, stair step. You say, okay, now I'm going to practice, and I'm going to practice not doing this.
Yeah.
and also doing other things beyond that maybe I used to think that this is how I handled this. Now I'm going to handle it this way, and I'm going to practice doing that over and over again. Then I'm going to reflect on that as my next step. And as I reflect on it, I go back to the basement again and, oh, I didn't know that now. And you keep walking up those steps until it gets to be second nature.
Yeah.
And what's fun in life was when someone is actually engaged in that and you watch them coming and saying, wait a minute, I just realized this and I just did that and and they get very excited about the growth and the releasing of the legacy that is so powerfully holding them in place and maybe having destructive impact around them. So.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's the steps of growth. The other piece of this that's really interesting is the level of what we'll call destructive entitlement. This is more of a Diane issue, and when she talks about some of the ways we retaliate and get back what we are owed. And you get to this space sometimes where people have been in this deficit. So they go around and you walk around and you wonder sometimes, how come they're always demanding, or how come they always think that we owe them and how come they're always asking and always, what is that? You get into these things where these people are like aggressive and they feel like you owe them the world. Well, often that's out of deficit. And that's out of, this is how I'm going to compensate for all that was taken away from me. Now I'm destructively entitled. Well, okay, that's also a family legacy because you've had losses. You had so many things taken away from you. And so now I'm hypervigilant about anybody that would take anything away from me.
Yeah.
And also parents may be saying, don't you take things away from me. So the kids say, well, I can't let you know. So it rolls on in transgenerational legacies. And in the process, it goes from family to family and grandparents to parents to kids to, And in the process of that, a lot of people walking around with this sense of somebody owes me something. And that's also a place to undo some stuff. Yeah. When you see a lot of that going on, there's usually a family legacy dynamic where there's abuse and neglect or something significant, like an adverse child experience or something that has been conditioning somebody to have that kind of response. And that's another way family legacies come in and do some interesting damage and work in our lives that make us into interesting people that you can't quite have a relationship with that feels healthy.
Right, because it seems like destructive entitlement is something that gets thrown around a lot, particularly with millennials, and which I guess I technically am a millennial.
Yes, you are.
But and I try not to be entitled, but it seems like there's also cultural legacies.
Yes.
As well, that are negative things that get passed down, or they can be negative things that get passed down generation to generation and cross culture, which are being aware that, just take the concept of family legacy and transpose it onto social legacies, and that's something to be aware of as well.
Racism
Yep.
is a family legacy.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Is something that you pass in generations, and you almost feel like you have to be loyal to it.
Yeah.
And, we might condemn somebody who's a racist, but you also have to understand that they're undoing a lot of stuff in their family. So a lot of the social issues that we have, if you think about a drug-addicted family, well, that's a culture.
Right, right.
If you think about greed in business, that's a culture. I was taught, well, the bottom line is money, and you only are measured by the money you make. That's a value. That's a core belief that gets instilled in some people very early in life while their brain is still developing. It doesn't stop till you're 25, 30. So some core beliefs hit the wall, and those are other kinds of legacies that we have. How much legacy work does schools do?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
All right, think about that one.
In school's a really common one that a lot of kids go through. Public school. That's all kind of the same. It can be very similar experience for everyone, and there's values that are drilled into you from the time you enter the door to the time you leave, and it's like your whole day as a kid. So and it's
so you add all of that up, and there are some people that just seem to be able to get through those things with a little more resilience and clarity. And there's some that just live identically to what it is and struggle because, oh, well, Mrs. So-and-so taught me that da-da-da-da-da, and that imprinted me, and I'm still trying to work that out, and we can't, you know.
Yeah.
And in the process, churches, another legacy-bound situation
Yeah. Yeah.
of a lot of hopeless guilt and shame that you can never get up, you know, and really make God into such an ogre.
Yeah.
And so there's all kinds of legacies that we targeted family, but
Yeah.
I think it's important to recognize that when we're looking at people that are struggling with a lot of different issues, the source of the legacy and the loyalty can be to some of our institutions that we hold up as these are places that we have to honor, school, church, you know.
And then even setting up those legacies, you know, in business as well. You
Exactly
can have
right.
those,
Yep.
because those are communities as well.
You know, I remember hearing some very interesting stories when I was coming up in the business world that I, you know, had to really assess and figure out as I was running my own organization to say, wait a minute, that's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I can't do that. And those are things that, you know, to me, it was a natural part of who I was when I managed something else and I had these expectations, you know, and I realized, whoa, I've got to think about the impact of that on the people around me. And that's very helpful when you realize who you're impacting and how you're impacting them.
Yeah. And in that same line of impacting, I know we're talking about family legacies and personal crisis, and that kind of lends itself to negative family legacies. But I want to talk just for a little bit on, like, if you know that family legacies exist, and you know you might be in a position like Serena and I that are on the early stages of building a family and thinking about kids down the line and things like that, and just, or even if you have young children or kids at all, knowing that there is this mechanism of family legacy, like.
Yeah.
You can work intentionally to build positive family legacies that your children are going to carry forward.
Right.
Right. You know, I was very fortunate in having you and Mom as parents, and that we had a lot of really good family legacies that I still enjoy today. And those are like, when you have good ones, you can kind of be like, okay, these are, I want to, you know, a little from column A, a little from column B. These are things that were really important and impactful for me that I want to then, you know, if I have children, I want that to be part of the family legacy as well. And even just talking a little bit about what some of those were, we mentioned this last week. We did, or I guess 2 weeks ago, we did an episode called Little Things, and Serena and I chatted about, you know, we've been very intentional about setting up this house to be a calm place and you know, an oasis amongst the chaos. And that was something that I got from you and Mom. It was, you know, you were very intentional. We've had conversations about it, about making the home a very safe place to be. And do you have anything to add to that as far as like how important that is for kids and development? And
Well, I think it really does come from parents having a commitment and to make the sacrifices to make that those values very, very real. I remember your mom and I saying, we really want our house to be a house of peace. And that sounds kind of an interesting term, but that means safety. I remember saying, I want my children always to be able to speak without judgment. If you look at our table today, you still can speak without judgment.
Yeah, and I was going to link that to like the outflow of that, the
Right.
practical application of this kind of safe thing we're talking about is family dinner. Family dinner is like a huge family legacy that we still do every Friday night.
Right. And I said, in the process, you know, you do sometimes when you have guests over regret that legacy because your kids say interesting things. But you know what? It's important that be allowed to happen. When we talk about discipline, how punitive are we versus how consequential are we? You know, it's okay for us to experience negative consequences, but the language and the anger and the judgment that comes because we as parents are frustrated, and rightly so. I mean, I get it. It's hard all day to manage these situations, but thinking about consequences as opposed to punitive types of measures makes all the difference in the world. We talked about parents who are willing to observe. Well, that means you are going to have a lot of self-acceptance to each developmental stage of your child. And while you are providing guidelines and discipline and, certainly some boundaries for what they can and can't do, when they step out of it, there's not this anger and contempt that says you're worthless, because these are normal developmental stages. Understanding child development is so important, because hey, you're doing your job. Like when people say, my kid's 13 and you did not, everything I've taught's gone out the window. And I went, they're doing their job.
Yeah.
Their brain's rewiring. Everything you taught them before has changed.
Yep.
And they're doing their job. They're doing their job of now becoming independent of you. And by the way, parenting is making them independent, not codependent or dependent. So the issue is you're trying to raise children to be independent of you. Well, that's tough as a parent. But when they make decisions that aren't your decisions, you tend to get angry. Well, maybe that's them experimenting with their independence.
Yeah.
So do you judge that? Go ahead.
Can I add into that really quick?
Yeah.
I want to make a point too that it's great to make sure you're not treating your kids like they should all be the same, because I'm an identical twin.
Right.
And
good point.
And you don't want to just say, okay, well, you don't want to treat your kid as they're doing the things, they're trying to learn their independence, but they're going to do it at different speeds. If you treat them the same, all your kids should be the same. That's totally not a valid, you can look at it that way, but that's not a healthy perspective either.
Well, perspective on child development also is perspective on temperament. You are different. You probably are a different temperament than your sister. So in the process of that honoring who this person is and learning who they are, and that's awesome. We want to do a cookie cutter. It's so much I want to do a cookie cutter.
So much easier if it was just black and white.
And let me tell you, Jeremy does not fit in any cookie cutter that we could figure out. So in the process, which is a beautiful thing, because you want them to be their own person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that you're working through. Do I want to make them into what? Me? Them? It? That's a basic question, but many people don't have a good answer to that. And so allowing the person to be who they are while you're doing guidance and direction to their growth and development, while you're shaping them for life and careers and being an adult, it's a job. It's a big challenge. And I think the values that you set as a family are really, really important, because those are the impressions you're going to leave. They're going to be imprints for the rest of their life that they'll either have to continue with positively or figure out why I'm doing some of the crazy stuff I'm doing and I need to get rid of those things because my dad or mom instilled that in me as a huge value that maybe wasn't too good. But I think on the side of being positive, you can set some values that are really the same things as relational integrity,
Right.
Some values that are all about how we solve our problems and how we give people room and how you have a right to your opinion, and the overall peaceful, calming environment of the home. Not a lot of craziness and lack of schedule and all the things that go on. And in today's society, the social media thing is playing such dominance for our families, and it's like we're all plugging into some electronic mode, but we're not plugging into each other, and therefore the teaching opportunities are very different. So, and I'm not saying I have a great answer for that, but I do know that we can't do that all the time and build relationship. So anyway, and relational dynamics.
Yeah.
What's kindness?
Having those conversations.
What's forgiveness? All of those. What's grace? What's proper love? What does it mean to have impact on each other? Just having those discussions. Hey, so your impact on that, or even when we're saying, is it okay for a parent to say to a child, when you do that, it makes me feel, to see that the child has impact. That's important.
Yeah, very important.
Right. I mean, because you're going back to your point of like you're pointing out consequences, not punishing.
Right.
Josh and I did all kinds of stuff growing up where it was, I never felt unjustly, punished or whatever. It was not like one of the stories that people are surprised by is when I barrel rolled mom's car. And which I think I told
We
this,
did talk
I
this
did talk
story,
about
yeah,
on the
we did.
podcast. And I, the car was like a month old or 3 months old or whatever. And I had my license for 3 weeks. And, long story short, I barrel rolled it going like 90 plus miles an hour, and the car was completely totaled. And, people were like, oh, your parents must have been so pissed. I was like, well, they were super happy that I didn't die and or hurt anybody else. And then I was like, the way I tell it was like, well, I was driving my mom's new car to work the following Monday, which was like 2 days later. And they're like, what? You didn't get like grounded? I'm like, no, they pretty much were like, I think you learned your lesson. I'm like, yeah, I got it. Like, what other consequence would I have needed in that circumstance? Like,
It's hard to get out of a car that's turned upside down. We figured you learned a few things.
yeah. When a car is smoking, you just got
That's
punched in the
crazy.
face by the airbag, and you have to crawl out through the passenger side window as the car's upside down. Like, I understood that happened because I was dumb.
That's
like,
a consequence.
consequence. Action, consequence. Got it. But I was like, well, what are they going to do? Like ground me? Like, I'm happy to be alive. I don't,
Yeah.
so, but we had, a lot of things like that were,
Well, and we understand that teenagers at that age play out risk.
yeah.
And high-risk behavior
Yeah.
is very normal to growth and development. And that's not the kind of risk I was hoping Jeremy
Right.
would take. And it was frightening, really, to all of us. And I think it was very dramatic for us emotionally to think about that as a consequence that he could have died. But in the process of it, I think it's important that we teach that consequences are real and impactful. But also, if consequences have taught you, I don't need to judge and blame and shame you either. We have to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of looking at the car was kind of a big consequence.
Yeah.
I think it's important. So
That was my bad. Like,
Yeah. I think we learned
Whoops.
that. Yep.
ooh. And I just remember Josh was like, was my PS2 in there? Like, it's fine.
Okay, so let's see if we can connect some of this here too. It's a great conversation about legacies and positive impact, negative impact. How do we use that when we're dealing with personal crisis? How do we use this conversation to help people get through personal crisis?
Good question.
that's a very good question.
Because it's great information, but let's connect it too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What we're trying to teach people
I think that often personal crisis can come from many sources, right? They can come from life events, things that you aren't prepared for, things you've created. As Jeremy said, over your time, you kept doing the same things, and now it caught up with you. There's lots of different scenarios. I think relating the impact, the consequences, if you will, of the personal crisis to the family legacies can be measured. I mean, sometimes it has nothing to do with the family legacy, but it has everything to do with how you process it. Because, for instance, if something comes from the outside and you believe there's no way you can ever be good enough, some people think they deserved it.
Right. Okay.
So when you're doing the process, you go, wait a minute, we have to disconnect that. We can't say that you deserve this. But if someone has constantly created it, and they, in essence, have created the consequence that's built to this issue,
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
there's got to
type
be a
thing.
responsibility for that. So then we've got to go, well, tell me, you've done this 46 times and it finally crested here in a big problem. Now we have to go back and say, why are you consistently doing the same thing over and over again, although we now have realized its negative impact to the world around you? And this is like, I don't know, good example, like someone who married someone who they felt like had all kinds of issues, but they believed they could fix it if you would just marry me. Common thing I see
Very
with
common.
women. Okay, you get to this point where you can't fix it, and it's now overtaken the whole relationship, and the whole thing is in jeopardy of even going any further. All right, we've got to say stop. But we've also got to say, well, wait a minute, you've enabled this for the whole time because you felt you could fix it. Let's go back to why it is that's your job. Maybe because you fixed a lot of other things in your own family, and you just kept right on going, and you look for somebody to fix. And if they had deficits, so that way you got to go, well, wait a minute, that is a family legacy issue. So I think it depends where it comes from, and what level does the legacy play into building to the consequence, to the crisis, how much it was involved. And the other thing is sort of the weird dynamics of something out here happens, and I plug my family legacies into it.
Right.
And
that's how you create context.
And you create a context for it by saying, "Oh, see, there it is again." Because whoa, wait a minute, is it? And let's sort out where it is and where it isn't. So it's a very interesting process to ask that, because again, you can't go one size fits all on that, but you can say, well, if that's created by the legacy, and even the positive legacies. If you've had this wonderful view of the world and it all goes to hell in a handbasket because of something else that's happened, like you're blindsided. Sorting all of that stuff out is pretty hard, and you tend to sort it from the perspective of the legacy. Yeah. And maybe it had nothing to do with the legacy at all. Or maybe it had everything to do with something down a different line of the legacy that really wasn't related to this event, but also is related to how you process it. So that's one of these great big it depends, how the legacy plays into the scenario. But what we do know is that these kinds of scenarios, positive and negative, are shapes who we are. And when who we are gets questioned, or when things
or rattled. When you're in crisis,
right?
Who you are can get totally questioned and rattled. And who am I now? And what do I do with all of this?
Yeah, stress in that framework.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's really putting a lot of stress on the framework, which makes you look at the framework. And then there's some holes. There's some strengths. Resilience is an amazing quality for people to have trying to overcome personal crisis. Where do you have resilience and where do you don't? Where do you not have resilience?
And I think if you're helping someone through a personal, if it's not yourself, it's someone you're close to or whatever, it gives you a context to be able to view if they're acting weird, right? That's like, it helps you to understand the context as well.
Right. So
yeah, that's good.
It's a little complicated at times, but I continually find that when I say to someone, so this is predictable in light of how you were raised, their aha moment was very intuitive. They kind of knew it all the time. At least they knew something wasn't right. Yeah. And what's encouraging is that most people that are walking around with heavy family legacies that may have led them in a bad place kind of know what it is. Now, are we willing to say it or be disloyal to it or identify it as a problem? It gets to be hard to do that sometimes.
I imagine that's really difficult because people, what you said earlier, that's how they get the sense of who they are.
Exactly.
And if you are sitting there saying, wow, I'm in this really terrible spot in my life. Here's all the family legacies, or even just one that has led up to this point. Am I willing to throw that out and literally become a new person?
Right.
That's really hard to do.
Right.
That's a really, really big ask for some people, even though you could look at it objectively from somebody way off in the distance and say, well, no, duh, take that road. It's better. But then you have to give up who you were.
It's loss.
Yeah.
Even when I lose something dysfunctional.
Yep.
Right.
It's still loss.
Yeah.
And that creates a whole other set of emotions that we have to be, I've actually had to say, you have permission to let that go. And they look at me and say, no, I don't.
Yeah. What are you talking about?
And tomorrow they do it again. I said, well, you have permission to let it go. No, I don't. Well, because the source never granted the permission, so I'm trying to be a surrogate parent at that point and say you have permission. And finally, the inevitable end is they have to give themselves permission to say, this isn't healthy, and I've really got to be forthright in saying I need to be disloyal to this. And I think that's really, really interesting. It's really, really interesting to me.
Well, and it seems like by understanding that family legacies are a real thing, that we all have our own family legacies, regardless of our background, what our family looked like, whatever, that as you start to examine your own life, you understand that like, okay, I've got my own set of family legacies, and you start to kind of like, okay, this is how I problem solve. That comes from this thing. My relationships I've normalized are like this because of how I was raised in this space. It gives you an appreciation and maybe a little bit more empathy for other people's family legacies as well, knowing that they also have their own set of values that perhaps are different than your own. And if things are like, oh, I come at things crooked, I've got like this weird habit that I do that was instilled like with that's like part of my family legacy. If I know I have to like actively, like we said with martial arts, like I've got to really focus on throwing that kick right. Other people are coming at it with different backgrounds as well. It just, for me, understanding it gives me an appreciation for how differently people are coming at things, and that not everyone, that was a harsh reality of figuring out that not everyone is coming from a healthy family background, and then understanding that like people can be mean, and and that people, there's like a lot of dysfunction and people are coming at things crooked, and not that our family had everything figured out and we were perfect and blah blah blah, but it was a safe place, and that not everyone grew up in a safe place, and that you just don't know when you're a kid. And then like had me and my brother, and that was like, all right, this seems everything's great, and then you get out into the world and be like I thought adults were smart, and then they were like you and mom, like you guys are rational, intelligent people, and then some adults are just grown up dumb kids. So it's like not quite the same as it was like, oh, there's people that have all kinds of legacy issues. That was something I remember being little and being like, oh, you can have an immature adult that makes bad choices. It was like not something I was exposed to.
Well, and I think that leads to the point that blends just the two things that you just said, because this idea of I'm starting over with a new identity means I have a blank slate as to knowing what to do.
Yeah.
But what happened that you just talked about, Jeremy, is that why don't adults have some of these skills? Why don't they have the maturity? Why don't they have because in many cases, when they were told they were not allowed to think for themselves, or they always made dumb decisions, or some of the issues that get thrown at them to somehow crazily protect them, it doesn't make any sense, they don't develop that part. So arrested development happens because of the power of the legacy and the messages, and the things that we need don't ever happen.
Yeah.
So if you make all the decisions for your children all the way through this process of growing up, and they're horrible decision makers, well, what happened? That didn't develop.
Right.
Because they didn't have the choices. And so now as adults, they still can't make decisions. Or if you've taught them to make dumb decisions, and they've always made the wrong decision, and the wrong decision isn't a negative because it has no boundary, it doesn't have any measuring place, it doesn't have any truth behind it or consequences behind it, and they keep on doing it. Why? Because that never got figured out. And so when you hold children back from what they need to do developmentally, you can also get a loyalty to not doing something normal. And then as adults, they end up incapable of doing it. And aside from a learning disability or something that is, physiologically a part of what they are, but
right.
Not including that. But often we teach people not to develop in our family legacies, and then you wonder, well, why don't they make decent decisions as adults? Because they never had the chance to develop that part, and that also affects the wiring.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how important is our family dynamic and parenting to allow the proper development of the brain and the values and all of that? It's just so important.
Yeah, and to connect something you just said is, in this process, sometimes the personal crisis is understanding the family legacy. It doesn't have to be something else. It doesn't have to be like the car accident or whatever, or losing a parent or whatnot. Right. Sometimes it is coming up against the family legacy, like a rock in a hard place. You're like, I have to look at this and become something new. That is a personal crisis right there.
It can be, because it's part of your identity.
Yeah.
And it's how you were shaped and what you believe and what you thought was good. And all of a sudden you wake up one day and it's not so good.
Yeah.
And
What?
you're going, well, wait, huh, thought you,
Yeah.
off to those
And
issues.
those moments
Yeah.
of awareness can be unsettling because you're like, oh, this is something I have to deal with. Like
Very
that's
challenging.
And
yeah.
then the work,
Yeah.
and
The
then,
work's
and as I
hard.
said, and if you have a void, you don't know what to do, now what?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got to drop that. What do I put in its place?
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have some healthy, instruction at that point,
Yeah.
Healthy alternatives.
yeah, we don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is unsettling and keeps us pretty insecure as we're going through growth steps to say, I'm going to learn
Mm-hmm.
how to do life over again.
Mhm.
It's sort of like a new thing. And by the way, I'm too old to learn this, but I've had people in their 80s actually
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
So it's possible. The brain is very plastic.
Yeah.
So we can learn things at any age. So
Yeah, that's always fascinating. The neuroplasticity.
Mhm.
It's like,
Mhm.
that's it's a real thing.
Mhm.
And I'd say, I think we covered a lot of the positive family legacies that you can be intentional about. That's the way that I frame it a lot, because that's kind of the stage of life that I'm in right now. Like, what type of home do I want to have? Even marriage is a relatively new thing for me and for Serena. So figuring that piece of it out, like what legacies do we want to start to develop with each other, and but it's been a very helpful thing and concept to understand, and then even being exposed to more and more people, gaining a deeper sense of empathy and understanding and graciousness towards people that are coming at things from a much different angle that I am, whether it's correct or not, but just knowing that it's impacted by, how they were raised and the community legacies, the social legacies, the family legacies, the institutional legacies, religious legacies. Like, there's so many things that impact someone as they're developing that it's, like we said in the last episode, when you're in that observer role and you're unpacking some of this stuff, it's just a nice concept to have a grasp on and understand that like what you see isn't what it is, as you say.
Mhm.
So,
Right. Right. Absolutely.
but yeah, I think we covered it. You got anything else to add, Sweetness?
I think I'm good.
Pops, any closing thoughts on family legacies and
Personal crisis.
personal crisis as it pertains to shit hitting the fan?
I think one of the big barricades to dealing with family legacies is the sense that I'm saying something really negative about my parents.
Okay. Yeah.
And what I want to reiterate is that none of us as parents had all the answers. We were all raised in totally interesting climates, and that we need to assume that people are kind of doing the best they can.
Mm-hmm.
And that means there's some times where we've got to forgive them
Mm-hmm.
and move on.
Yeah.
It isn't about being angry or blaming and shaming our parents, because that kind of stops us at times. If we go down that road, it stops us from being able to change.
Yeah.
So part of the real some of the hard parts of this sometimes is to be able to say, you know what, they were doing the best they could with what they had. Maybe some horrible crisis happened in their lives and they didn't know how to cope with it, and therefore they did this and this and this. And that even though they struggled with their own world, I don't have to be subject to that same struggle. And I can sort of bring a redeeming quality to our legacy as a family by doing a redo.
Right. And you can choose to not pass that legacy on to your own family.
And when I say to people, you think you have to pass these to your kids because you're loyal, the answer is no, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And we now have a chance to fix some of this and not only affect our kids, but every generation after that.
Absolutely.
So the power of this is that ability to look backwards a little bit, know what it is, and then to take it, make the changes that we need to in our own life, and then look forward to the fact that our children have a chance to be a lot healthier, a lot better, not hooked into these things in the same way. And because, man, life is tough enough without the legacies. But if we can provide a stable, safe, loving, kind, caring, non-punitive, but instructive environment for our kids to develop in, we can create a great future for our own family, for our communities, for our culture, for our country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a cool thing to think about when you say, let me deal with my family legacies. It's not just passed to you.
Yeah.
It is now that you passing it to others.
Mm-hmm.
And we have good opportunity now to create a new generation of people that are really healthy
Mm-hmm.
and able to function in a good zone
Yeah.
for themselves. So,
Sweet. That's perfect. I think we'll put a pin in it right there. Thanks, guys.
yep.
See you.
That is it for us today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you liked that episode. As I said in the intro, this was one of my favorite episodes. I love digging in and diving down deep into the world of family legacies and understanding why people do some of the things that they do, and even why I do some of the things that I do. It helps you to be a better person all the way around, but especially a better, more effective person in case of personal crisis or
Yep.
dealing with crisis situations in general. For show notes, you guys can, you know the drill. You can find those show notes on our website at thepainterandthepixie.com. And for show updates and other fun little things through the week, you can follow us on Instagram at thepainterandthepixie, all spelled out.
Mm-hmm. And I think family legacies are a very impactful concept that can be enlightening and creating some awareness on some of these things that we're talking about over last week, this week, and the upcoming weeks. Can be somewhat disruptive, so we're definitely aware of that. We might be stirring up some things,
Yeah, it's
but
all right.
overall,
Hang
it's
with us.
very, very, I think, very important stuff to understand and work through and be mindful of and kind of reflective on that as well. So
Yeah, I don't know anyone else who's talking about this stuff right now. So I love that we're able to have these conversations and share them with so many people, because I think it's really important to be exposed to this information. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And once you have an introduction and you have a framework then to jump forward with, some pretty cool things can happen.
yeah. So hopefully, this will be a catalyst for some change for some people, and just, maybe just enlightening for others, and, all good things. So anyway, guys, I really hope you all enjoyed that one. I was super pumped to have my dad back on, and if all goes as planned, we're going to have him on with
At least once more.
with another guest for a finale of the series, which should be super sweet. But yeah, anything else, Sweetness?
I think we're good.
Good?
Awesome.
Awesome. Cool. All right, guys. Well, y'all relax, be kind, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Salute.
Amazing.